The Light and the Glory, 1492 to 1793. Peter Marshall and David Manuel. Let's go straight to, since this is Thanksgiving, and I like to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, let's go to 8, To the Promised Land.
8. To the Promised Land. Descending into the gloomy interior of the Mayflower II, the replica of the Pilgrim's ship, we were shocked at the closeness of the quarters. 102 pilgrims had been crammed into a space about equal to that of a volleyball court. Compound that misery by the lack of light and fresh air. All hatches had to be battened down because of the stormy weather. Add to it a diet of dried peas, dried fish, and wormy biscuits, along with the stench of an ever fouler bilge, and multiply it all by 66 days at sea. As we emerged topside, Peter shook his head. You know, they accepted all that with very little complaining. It was part of what they were willing to endure to follow God's will. He paused, like the exile in Holland and their indenture in the New World. Later that afternoon, as we climbed the dirt road that is the main street of the reconstruction of Plymouth Plantation, we were again struck by the enormous price these people had paid. It had been one thing to see the magnificence of the poured-out commitments of the missionaries, but these Jesuit, Dominican, and Franciscan martyrs seemed almost destined for sainthood from the moment of conversion. The pilgrims, by contrast, were ordinary Christian families, not unlike our own. Compared to them, our commitment to Christ seemed pale and shallow. As we became convicted of this, not as much by what the pilgrims preached or wrote but by the lives they lived, it was a humbling experience. Considering themselves only marginally successful, they had no awareness of the spiritual impact their community would have on the Puritans who came behind them, on the founding of a Christian nation, and on all those in subsequent ages who would be inspired by their example. Prior to our visit to Plymouth, the question had arisen, if the Pilgrims and the Massachusetts Bay Puritans were together responsible for most of the constitutional and institutional foundations of this country, why does this comparative handful of Pilgrims who never matched the achievements of their Puritan cousins a few miles to the north and were eventually absorbed by them, move the hearts of Americans on such deep levels? Why, for some people, is a visit to Plymouth Plantation more like a pilgrimage than a sightseeing tour? Driving away from the town that afternoon, we felt we were beginning to see the answer. On a warm, hazy July morning in 1620, 3 barges glided along a Dutch canal, en route from Leiden to the seaport of Delftshaven. In the distance, across the broad, low fields, a large stone windmill basked in the early morning sun, its huge white sails barely turning. It was a morning for tarrying, for taking in the fragrance of new mown hay and the muted chirping of field crickets. But there could be no tarrying for the congregation on these barges. For a third of them it was the beginning of a much longer voyage, a voyage from which there would be no return. One of these was William Bradford, a young, strong, enthusiastic English farmer who was counted among their chief men. He had been with their pastor, John Robinson, from the very beginning in Yorkshire, 14 years before. Orphaned at an early age, he had been raised by an aunt and uncle and grandparents until the age of 12, when he had been converted by the preaching of Richard Clifton. The young lad's awakened conscience led him to join in spirit with the relative handful of radical Christians who had dared to separate from the Church of England. In the ensuing 2 years, Bradford's spiritual defection had so infuriated his relatives that they threatened to disown him if he didn't return. In a letter to them, he wrote, "Were I like to endanger my life, or consume my estate by any ungodly courses, your counsels to me were very seasonable, but you know that I have been diligent and provident in my calling, and not only desirous to augment what I have, but also to enjoy it in your company, to part from which will be as great a cross as can befall me. Nevertheless, to keep a good conscience, and walk in such a way as God has prescribed in His Word, is a thing which I must prefer before you all, and above life itself." 1. Already at the age of 14, Bradford was showing signs of the spiritual maturity that would make him one of America's foremost Christian leaders. When his staunchly Anglican relatives made good on their threats, the printer William Brewster took the young man into his home in nearby Scrooby. If on the barge that morning in 1620 Bradford recalled those early years, it might have been with a sense of wonder. So much had passed into history since then. He would write it all down one day, years hence. It is well known unto the godly and judicious, however, since the first breaking out of the light of the gospel in our honorable nation of England, what wars and oppositions ever since Satan hath raised, maintained, and continued against the saints, i.e., believers who are striving to yield their whole lives to Christ, sometimes by bloody death and cruel torments, otherwise imprisonments, banishments, and other hard usages, as being loath that his kingdom should go down, the truth prevail, and the churches of God revert to their ancient purity and recover their primitive order, liberty, and beauty. 2. The churches to which Bradford was referring were those of the Church of England, presided over by the House of Bishops. The church hierarchy had grown alarmed at the rapid growth of two movements of fanatics. The first and much larger group claimed to be dedicated to purifying the church from within. That made them suspect from the start to the bishops, who saw nothing which needed purifying. These Puritans, as they were sarcastically dubbed, and which epithet they eventually took for their own, did, however, continue to acknowledge canonical authority. Thus they could be easily kept from positions of responsibility and safely ignored. In the bishops' eyes, the much smaller but more dangerous element were the radicals who thought that the Church of England was already corrupted beyond any possibility of purification. They further believed that no person, not even the Queen, could take the title head of the Church. That belonged exclusively to the Lord Jesus Christ. Having separated themselves from the state church, they now conducted their own worship as they saw fit. If allowed to continue, these separatists would soon reduce worship to primitive preaching, teaching, singing, and free praying, thus doing away with 16 centuries of established liturgical tradition. This was the group young William Bradford had joined. At present they numbered less than 1,000, but clearly if this sort of thing were tolerated, other believers who spoke enthusiastically of experiencing a personal encounter with Christ might decide to follow their lead. Before long, little churches of fanatics would be popping up everywhere, with no semblance of order or conformity, and totally out of the bishop's control. Queen Elizabeth had not given the bishops the free hand which they sought to suppress this contagion before it became an epidemic. She seemed to feel that occasional executions for heresy were sufficient to hold the movement in check. But now that the vain, petty, and manipulable James I was on the throne, the bishops had their way. The separatists were hounded, bullied, forced to pay assessments to the Church of England, clapped into prison on trumped-up charges, and driven underground. They met in private homes, to which they came at staggered intervals by different routes, because they were constantly being spied upon. In the Midlands village of Scrooby the persecution became so intense that the congregation elected to follow other separatists who had already sought religious asylum in Holland. Thus they came to Leiden, where they were forged together by shared adversity. As near penniless foreign immigrants, they qualified for only the most menial labor and had to work terribly hard just to subsist. Bradford wrote that before coming, they had, as the Lord's free people, joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in the fellowship of the gospel, to walk in all his ways made known unto them, according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. 3. It cost them dearly. By 1619, after nearly a dozen years of penurious toil, they finally decided that they had to remove. Bradford offered 4 reasons for moving. First, their life, though they never complained of it, was so hard that almost no others were coming from England to join them, even after the King's Edict of 1618, which decreed that all Christians unwilling to conform to ecclesiastical authority had to leave the country. Second, their life was aging them prematurely. Everyone old enough to hold a job worked 12 to 15 hours a day, and was so debilitating that, if the time came when they would have to move again, they might not physically be able to do so. Third, their children were also being worn down, and many were being drawn away by the lures of the world around them. Fourth, they had cherished a great hope and inward zeal of at least playing a part, if only as a stepping stone for others, in the carrying forth of the light of Christ to remote parts of the world. Increasingly, the separatists came to believe that North America was the place to which God intended them to go, despite the horrors of Virginia's starving time, which had reached their ears, and the well-known savagery of the Indians. Considering that the death rate at Jamestown after 12 years was still well over 50%, an insidious counter-proposal was raised. Might there not be an easier way? Why not go south to Guyana on the coast of South America, which Walter Raleigh had so warmly described, and where the English already had a foothold? It was rich, fruitful, and blessed with a perpetual spring, and flourishing greens, where vigorous nature brought forth all things in abundance and plenty without any great labor or art of man. 4. Raleigh had also mentioned an abundance of gold mines. 5. Thus does Satan ever seek to divide and sow dissension among the Christians he so hates. But the Leadonites were mature enough in their faith to know better than to reason things out with only their intellects. The crucial question in all of this was, what was God's will? Where did he want to send them? From hard experience they had learned that as long as they were in the center of his will, it did not matter where they were physically located. After they had prayed and entrusted the entire undertaking into his hands, peace returned, and with it some considerations that had hitherto escaped them. Guyana was close to the Spanish Main, and the jealous Spaniards had already wiped out the French Huguenots. And if gold was there, that would only lure the Spanish more quickly. Also, the tropical climate engendered diseases that had already decimated the crews of dozens of ships passing through the Indies. The more they prayed, the clearer it became that God wanted them to go to North America. Bradford summed up their strengthening resolve. It was answered that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. It was granted that the dangers were great, but not desperate, and the difficulties were many, but not invincible, and all of them, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be borne or overcome. But their condition was not ordinary. Their ends were good and honorable, their calling lawful and urgent, and therefore they might expect the blessing of God in their proceeding. Yea, though they should lose their lives in this action, yet they might have comfort in the same, and their endeavors would be honorable. 6. As the Leadonites worked out where they were going, their elected pastor, John Robinson, was praying for a deeper revelation of why they were going. Did God have a special purpose for them? To Robinson and Elder William Brewster and a few of the other leaders, that purpose was beginning to come clear. As Robinson would shortly write, he perceived that God was calling them to a new Jerusalem, to build his temple anew, with themselves as its living stones, now as the people of God in old time were called out of Babylon civil, the place of their bodily bondage, and were to come to Jerusalem, and there to build the Lord's temple, or tabernacle. So are the people of God now to go out of Babylon spiritual to Jerusalem, and to build themselves as lively stones into a spiritual house, or temple, for the Lord to dwell in. 7. It seemed that God had indeed chosen them and was now in the process of preparing them to become his temple in America. It was resolved then that they were going. They were already being led in a path that had once been walked by another chosen people, for we are, wrote Robinson, the sons and daughters of Abraham by faith. But getting to America was another matter. The cost of transporting them there would be enormous, to say nothing of the expense of sufficient food supplies to last them until they could plant, grow, and harvest a crop. In addition to that, they would need a pinnace with which to go fishing or trading. The French had built up a lucrative fur trade in the far north, and it occurred to the Leadonites that they might be able to do the same. Transports, pinnaces, a year's provisions for 100 people. Where on earth were they going to get that kind of money? The Virginia Company was the main corporate enterprise engaged in the business of backing ventures to America. Accordingly, Robinson and Brewster drafted the 17th century equivalent of a business plan and sent it to Edwin Sands, the treasurer of the company. A straightforward application for financing. It outlined the reasons for confidence. 1. We verily believe and trust the Lord is with us, unto whom and whose service we have given ourselves in many trials, and that he will graciously prosper our endeavors according to the simplicity of our hearts therein. 2. We are well weaned from the delicate milk of our mother country, and inured to the difficulties of a strange and hard land, which yet in a great part we have by patience overcome. 3. The people are, for the body of them, as industrious and frugal, we think we may safely say, as any company of people in the world. 4. We are knit together as a body in a most strict and sacred bond and covenant of the Lord, of the violation whereof we make great conscience, and by virtue whereof we do hold ourselves strictly tied to all care of each other's good, and of the whole by everyone and so mutually. 5. Lastly, it is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves at home again. 8. But while Sands was sympathetic, the hard truth was that the Virginia Company was on the brink of bankruptcy, and now so disturbed with factions and quarrels amongst themselves, as no business could go well forward, and so the Leadonites were providentially spared that entanglement. Not long after that, they were paid an unexpected visit by a London merchant named Thomas Weston. All smiles and encouragement, Weston informed them that he was an independent adventurer, representing a group that had heard of their plight and decided to help them. The Leadonites could forget the Virginia Company, though it might be useful to sail under their charter. Instead, they could put their faith in Weston, who assured them that he felt the same way about the things of God as they did and that he would see them through, no matter what. Englishmen who did have money to speculate on trading, exploration, and settlement were almost exclusively being attracted to the Muscovy Company or the East India Tea Company, both of which promised a 100% return on one's investment in 6 months. And so, as it seemed to be the only door open to them, with some misgivings the Leadonites entered into an agreement with Weston. Should they have heeded the misgivings that some of them had? Should they have waited on God a little longer, trusting him to open yet another door? If you had waited as long as they had, you might have chosen as they did. To them, it wasn't the easier way, it was the only way. But now there was much to be done. Families who were going sold their houses and all their immovable possessions to give Weston cash with which to purchase shares in the plantation venture. Their agreement was that each adult, 16 years and older, would have one share, worth £10, almost $1,000 and another share if he outfitted and equipped himself. Those with extra funds could, of course, buy more shares. All would continue in joint partnership for 7 years, the standard period of indenture, at the end of which time all land and profits would be divided up according to the number of shares. Personal property, such as houses, home lots, and gardens, would remain wholly the property of the planters and would not be divided up. The planters were also to be given 2 days a week of their own. It struck them as an eminently fair agreement, so Weston went off to London to confer with his partners and to see about hiring a ship to transport them. The separatists sent 2 of their number to London to represent them, John Carver and Robert Cushman. Carver had a stability and maturity about him that had already proven an asset. Cushman had a quick mind and a gift for eloquence, but he was immature and had difficulty accepting correction. While Carver was out of London gathering supplies for the coming voyage, Weston applied pressure to Cushman and got him to agree to certain changes in their contract. Next on the agenda was the purchase of a pinnace, and this must have been like shopping for a used car with not enough money. Eventually they settled on an old freighter named the Speedwell, which would pick them up at Delftshaven and take them to Southampton. There they would join a larger merchantman, the Mayflower, hired by the adventurers. But only a third of their 600-plus congregation could go. That meant that the man who wanted most to go, John Robinson, would have to stay behind. The main body of the flock could not be without its shepherd. So it was decided that their elder, William Brewster, would be their teacher and acting pastor until such time as Robinson could come over. The time had come to part. Robinson declared a day of fasting and prayer to prepare them spiritually for the arduous voyage to come. At the end of the day, they had a farewell dinner, celebrating with goose and pudding and wine, and singing their favorite songs from Ainsworth's psalm book in the intricate, madrigal-like harmonies that so delighted the ear. Edward Winslow, one of the leaders, described the scene as follows: "We refreshed ourselves, after our tears, with the singing of psalms, making joyful melody in our hearts as as well as with the voice, there being many in the congregation very expert in music, and indeed it was the sweetest melody that ever mine ears have heard. 9. The next morning, as many as could accompanied the voyagers by barge to Delftshaven. Looking back at the red-tiled roofs of Leiden receding in the distance and the great windmill with its white sails slowly turning, Bradford may have had a pang of regret. If he did, it was only temporary, for they knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on those things, but lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. 10. When they reached Delftshaven, they made straight for the harbor, and there was the Speedwell, a good deal smaller and older than most of them had pictured her. The rest of the afternoon and most of the evening were spent loading food and cargo into every conceivable cranny. Dawn on July 22, 1620, was greeted with a fair wind, and now it really was time to say goodbye. On the dock John Robinson slowly knelt, and all the others followed his lead. As he solemnly invoked God's blessing on their undertaking, tears came to all of their eyes, and even the young men wept unabashedly. Quickly they boarded the ship, and the crew cast off. With the wind behind them, they soon reached Southampton, where they joined the 90-ton Mayflower. On board were their agents, Carver and Cushman, joyously reunited with their families, and about 80 strangers. Some of these shared the Leidenites' feelings regarding the Church of England, but others were there because they had believed Weston's enticements about the profits to be had in the wilderness. Among the strangers were the rambunctious John Billington, his shrewish wife, and 2 rebellious teenage sons, the more devout bootsmith William Mullins, his wife, 2 children, and 138 pairs of shoes and boots, and John Alden, the cooper that each ship was required by law to carry in order to tend the ship's casks and barrels. One who had asked to go with them and was turned down was none other than the feisty soldier of fortune Captain John Smith. Here, at least, the Pilgrim's discernment regarding people was working well. From the Latin group there were 16 men, 11 women, and 14 children, barely a third of the combined total of saints and strangers. And of these, only Bradford and William and Mary Brewster were original members of the Scrooby Church. Others among the saints included the Brewsters' sons, Love and Wrestling, John Carver and his wife, Catherine, Edward and Elizabeth Winslow, William and Dorothy Bradford. They had left their only son behind, deciding he was too young to make the initial voyage, Dr. Samuel Fuller, and Captain Miles Standish, a tough and steady veteran of the Netherlands wars, and his wife, Rose. The master and part owner of the Mayflower was an old professional who was hired with his crew to take the Pilgrims, as they had now come to sea themselves, just south of the mouth of the Hudson, within the northernmost boundary of the Virginia Charter. He had agreed to stay with them long enough for them to get a start on settling in, but any time beyond that would cost them extra because it would be cutting into his earning time. The master's name was Jones, and his Christian name was the same as that of another captain God had used to bear the light of Christ westward, Christopher. With everything finally ready for departure, Thomas Weston chose that precise moment to present a revised contract that effectively doubled their season of indenture from 7 to 14 years. He fully expected them to object, but because they had said all their farewells and committed all their funds to the endeavor, they would simply have to sign. To his astonishment, they refused. In a rage, Weston stormed off to London, refusing to settle their final debts, which came to some £60. So they had to sell off several £1,000s of butter, which happened to be their only food surplus. And then they wrote the adventurers in London a compromise letter, stating that if large profits should not arise within 7 years, we will continue together longer with you, if the Lord give a blessing. 11 they were, in effect, offering to extend their indentureship almost indefinitely. With their consciences now as clear as their credit balance, they were free to sail. At this point, Brewster assembled the company to read them a letter that John Robinson had prepared for them. We are daily to renew our repentance with our God, especially for our sins known, and generally for our unknown trespasses. 4. Sin being taken away by earnest repentance and the pardon thereof from the Lord, great shall be a man's security and peace in all dangers, sweet as comforts in all distresses. Robinson went on to warn them that their intended course of civil community will minister continual occasion of offense, and will be as for that fire, except you diligently quench it with brotherly forbearance. With your common employments you should join common affections, truly bent upon the general good. In closing, he enjoined them, whereas you are to become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any persons of special eminency above the rest, i.e., no gentlemen on the passenger list, they would have to choose their leaders from among equals. Let your wisdom and godliness appear not only in choosing such persons as do entirely love and will promote the common good, but also in yielding unto them you all due honor and obedience in their lawful administrations. For the image of the Lord's power and authority, which the magistrate beareth, is honorable. For some of the strangers hearing Robinson's letter, it may have been their first realization that unlike the Jamestown colony, there were no gentry among them. Moreover, the Pilgrims were accustomed to seeking God's will in every step of the planning, as the Jamestown people had not, so he was more able to winnow out from among them any who might be unwilling to work with the rest. There could be no spectators, all had to participate. Having finally set sail for the New World on August 5, 1620, they were barely 3 days out on the Atlantic before it became obvious that the Speedwell was in trouble. The new masts with which they had fitted her in Holland were apparently causing her seams to work open under full sail. They had no choice but to turn back to the nearest port, Dartmouth, and recalk her. Another week passed, and they again set forth, only to encounter the same problem. This time, it was abetted by a full gale that initiated the Pilgrims to the rigors of seasickness. Once more they were forced to turn back, this time making for Plymouth, the home of some of the best shipwrights in England. There they searched the ship for a loose seam. And how they searched! Holding lighted candles up close to each seam, they crept the length of the ship looking for the slightest waver in the flame that would indicate a less than airtight joining. Surprisingly, they found nothing wrong with her hull. In spite of that, they finally made the difficult decision not to take any further chances with the Speedwell. They would sell her and combine her passengers and cargo with those on board the Mayflower. Some historians have found hints that the master of the Speedwell, anxious to get out of his contract to spend a year at the plantation, had deliberately crowded on sail to make the seams work loose. Indeed, the Speedwell, later air-rigged, would see coastal service for many years. But there was another explanation. God was using the Speedwell's problems to further separate the wheat from the chaff. As William Stoughton later put it, God sifted a whole nation, that he might send choice grain into this wilderness. 12. A number of them, whose hearts themselves had seams that might part if heavily worked, now began to wonder if it truly was God's will that they make this voyage. About 20 of them willingly dropped out. Like Gideon's army, Bradford wrote, this small number was divided, as if the Lord, by this work of his providence, thought these few were still too many for the great work he had to do. 13 There were some surprises among their number, like Robert Cushman, whose heart and courage was gone from them before, as it seems, though his body was with them till now he departed. Bradford then quoted from a letter written in Dartmouth by Cushman to a friend, for besides the imminent dangers of this voyage, which are not less than deadly, our victuals will be half eaten up, I think, before we go from the coast of England, and if our voyage last long, we shall not have a month's victuals when come to the country. Indeed, by the time they left Plymouth, they were already consuming the precious reserves meant to sustain them in the New World. Friend, concluded Cushman, if ever we make a plantation, God works a miracle. Though he may have spoken from despair, it was the truth. God had so intended. There was another reason for God's narrowing the company down to one ship, to make it indeed a company. It had taken years of baptism by fire to temper the spiritual core of the Pilgrims into hardened steel, but now there were only a few weeks available in which to temper these strangers and anneal them to the Pilgrims' core. For unless they were so bonded, they would soon fly apart under the pressures that awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Much could be done, but it would require tremendous heat and pressure. The heat and the pressure began soon after they got underway. 102 pilgrims huddled in the lantern-lit darkness of the low-ceilinged twin decks. No hatches open because of continuous storms. All non-essential personnel required to stay below decks. The constant crying of small children. No chance to cook any meals. It added up brings up sins that had lain buried for years. Anger, self-pity, bitterness, vindictiveness, jealousy, despair. All these surface sins had to be faced, confessed, and given up to the Lord for his cleansing. No matter how ill they felt or how grim the daily situation, they continued to seek God together, praying through despair and into peace and thanksgiving. The weary pilgrims were forced to endure yet another ordeal, harassment from the sailors. Several of the crew had taken to mocking them unmercifully, and their self-appointed leader had taken such a dislike to the pilgrims that he would gloat at their seasickness and delight in telling them how much he looked forward to sewing them in shrouds and feeding them to the fish, for surely some of them would soon be dying. Death was a familiar shipmate among landlubbers on transatlantic voyages, and these were the puniest assortment of some singing puke stockings he had ever seen. But just at the peak of his tormenting, this same crewman suddenly took gravely ill of an unknown fever and died within a single day. No one else caught this mysterious disease, and his was the first shrouded body to go over the side. Thereafter, there was no more mocking from the crew. There was only one other death during the voyage. William Button, a servant, ignored Master Jones's and Dr. Fuller's stern admonition about drinking a daily portion of lemon juice as a preventative for scurvy. He refused to swallow the sour stuff, and his willful disobedience cost him his life. Another passenger nearly paid with his life for a minor infraction. A dozen or so days into the storm, John Howland, the servant of their governor, John Carver, could no longer stand the stench of the crowded 'tween decks. The master, Elder Brewster, and his own master had forbidden any of them to go topside, but if he didn't get a breath of fresh air soon, he thought he would die. Finally, he decided that he was going to get what he wanted. Up he climbed and out onto the sea-swept main deck. It was like a nightmare out there. The seas around him were mountainous. He'd never seen anything like it. Huge, boiling, gray-green waves lifting and tossing the small ship in their midst, dark clouds roiling the horizon, and the wind shrieking through the rigging. Howland shuddered, and it was not from the icy blast of fresh air that hit him. Just then, the ship seemed to literally drop out from beneath him. It was there, and then it wasn't, and the next thing he knew, he was falling. He hit the water, which was so cold that it was like being smashed between two huge blocks of ice. His last conscious act was to blindly reach out. By God's grace, the ship at that moment was heeled so far over that the lines from her spars were trailing in the water. One of these happened to snake across his wrist, and instinctively he closed on it and hung on. According to the U.S. Navy, if a person goes overboard into the North Atlantic in November, he or she has at most 30 minutes to live. There is no telling how long Howland was in the sea, how soon someone spotted him and raised the alarm. When they hauled him aboard, he was blue. But even though he was sick for several days, he recovered, and never again would he stick his head above deck until he was invited to do so. The most frightening episode of the voyage occurred not long after the Mayflower passed the halfway mark. In a particularly violent storm, she was rolling so far over on her sides that the sail lantern seemed almost parallel with the crossbeams. Children were screaming, and more than a few pilgrims feared she might shift her cargo and go all the way over. Suddenly a tremendous boom resounded through the ship. The main crossbeam supporting the mainmast had cracked and was sagging alarmingly. Now the sailors' concern matched the pilgrims. They swarmed about it, trying to lever it back into place, but they could not budge it. Master Jones himself came to see. From the look on his face, it was obvious to the pilgrims that the situation was as ominous as they had feared. The pilgrims helped in the only way they knew how. They prayed, "Yet Lord, thou canst save." Then Brewster remembered the great iron screw of his printing press. It was on board somewhere. A desperate search was begun. Finally it was located, dug out, hauled into place under the sagging beam, and cranked up. It met the beam and, to the accompaniment of a hideous creaking and groaning of wood, began to raise it, all the way back into its original position. For once the sailors joined the pilgrims in their praises of God. Earnestly Brewster, Carver, and Bradford questioned the master as to the Mayflower's seaworthiness. He thought about it. They were now closer to America than to England, though they would have to win for them on the return. No, he decided, she's still sound under the water, and that's the main thing. She's made many trips in weather worse than this, and words they had waited so long to hear rang out from the lookout, Lin Ho. Without waiting for the master's permission, they rushed up on the main deck, where they caught their first glimpse of a long, sandy stretch of coastline, covered with dune grass and scrub pine. One of the pilots identified it as a place the fishermen called Cape Cod. Despite the seemingly endless storm, they had actually been blown less than 100 miles off their course, north, as it turned out. It should take them only a day to round the elbow of the Cape and perhaps 3 more days to reach the mouth of the Hudson. They turned south. But at the Cape's elbow, Monoway Point, there are fierce shoals and riptides. And with the heavy headwinds they now faced, the going became progressively more treacherous. Finally, after battling the wall of wind for 2 days, Master Jones said that before attempting to proceed further south, he would have to head back out to sea and wait another day. Now Brewster, Carver, Winslow, Bradford, and several others began to wonder if God really did want them to go to the Hudson. Perhaps he had blown them here because he intended them to remain in this place. At length, after much prayer and further discussion, they instructed Master Jones to turn about and make for the northern tip of the Cape, Provincetown. This he did, and on November 11th, they dropped anchor in the National Harbor just inside the Cape. At this point, a new question arose. If they were to settle here, they would no longer be under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. And since they obviously had no patent from the New England Company, they would be under no one. This thought stirred rebellion in the hearts of some of the strangers, and the Pilgrim leaders realized that they had to act quickly and decisively to forestall the very real possibility of mutiny. Their solution was pragmatic and expedient. It took into consideration the basic sinfulness of human nature, with which they had become all too familiar during the past 7 weeks. They drafted a compact, much along the lines of their first covenant back in Scrooby, which embodied the principles of equality and government by the consent of the governed. Actually, this concept of equality could be traced directly back to the ancient Hebrew tradition of all men being equal in the sight of God. The Mayflower Compact would become cornerstone of American representative government. Although the Pilgrims had no idea of the significance for America of what they had done, it marked the first time in history since the children of Israel in the Sinai wilderness, with the exception of John Calvin's Geneva, that free and equal men had voluntarily covenanted together to create their own new civil government based on biblical principles. In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken, for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign King James of England, Anno Domini 1620.14. Such ringing affirmations as we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal would have to wait another century and a half to be openly stated in a government document, but here was their introduction onto American soil. It is Bradford who rightly brings this chapter to a close. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. And no marvel if they were thus joyful. 15 They had begun their long journey by kneeling on the dock at Delftshaven to ask God's blessing. They ended it on the sands of Cape Cod, kneeling to thank him for that blessing. Yet Bradford, always the realist, went on to marvel at this poor people's present condition. No friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. With winter storm with winter storms howling around the tip of the Cape, whichever way they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. Let it also be considered what weak hope of supply and succor they left behind them. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? Gales involve winds from 50 to 80 knots. Above that, it is a full-fledged hurricane.